Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to the Standard Chartered Bank ENSafrica webinar series on combating financial crime in Uganda. Today is the first of 3 events on combating financial crime. We will be hearing about financial crimes, what they are, and why it is important for Uganda as an investment destination and as a business environment to fight financial crime. We'll hear about the risks posed by financial crime to our economy and to our national security. We'll be talking about countering the financing of terrorism, anti-money laundering, and other exciting acronyms. To carry the torch for us today, this morning, we have a distinguished keynote speaker and distinguished panelists. Our keynote speaker today is Mr. Sidney Asubo, the Executive Director, Financial Intelligence Authority. Sidney is the founder CEO of the FIA. He has been in office since 2015. Previously, he served as the Director Legal Affairs at the Inspectorate of Government, which is the main anti-corruption agency in Uganda. He also served as a Senior State Attorney at the Directorate of Public Prosecutions in Uganda, where he prosecuted serious crimes and did criminal justice policy work. He has represented Uganda in many international criminal justice fields, particularly financial crime, corruption, anti-money laundering, and CTF. He is a member of the task force of East and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group. He's the chairman of senior officials of the group, which brings together 18 member countries, and he will be chairman until the end of this year. He's also a review expert under the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and has participated during the review of Uganda's compliance with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Sidney will be speaking to us for 20 minutes. He'll be telling us about his highs and lows of his 6-year tenure in office. And most importantly, he'll be telling us whether Uganda is winning this important war. If you have any questions, please post to the Q&A box and we'll be happy to take them. Sidney, you're welcome to take the stage. I will introduce the panelists shortly. Sidney, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for that very generous introduction. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank ENSafrica and the Standard Chartered Bank Group in general, and the Standard Chartered Bank Uganda in particular, for putting together this series. And I'm happy to be invited to provide the keynote address for the first in the 3-part series. I have written a paper on this particular topic. I've titled it Uganda's Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Finance Terrorism Landscape, 2014 to 2021, the pitfalls and successes. It's a 16-page document, so which I don't think will be ideal for us to be highlighting in the course of the presentation, but the organizers have promised that at the end of the series or at some point, the presentation in full will be shared with all registered participants. So because it is 16 pages, I will not be going it in full in the knowledge that it will be distributed at the end. So I will only highlight the key points of my presentation within the 20 minutes that have been assigned to me. I always tell my listeners that if I'm not restrained on these topics, I can speak forever. So, but I will try to live within the 20 minutes that have been allocated to me, so that we give ample time for the panelists to make their presentations and also for Q&A. So I will now straight away delve into into the issue. I have an introduction about what the FATF is, but I think our colleague Stephen will be speaking more about the global context. So I'll skip much of that about FATF. All I can say for now that the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, is recognized as the main global standard-setting body for matters to do with the combating money laundering, combating financing of terrorism, as well as there's a third one which many people often forget, combating the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So it's quite a mouthful of a title. So we simply shorten it for layman to say combating proliferation. But the full title is combating the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So the FATF is the main standard-setting body in this regard. And then we have what we call the international infrastructure, or the architecture for this, because the FATF has 39 member countries. Now, the criterion for admission to FATF is quite stringent. But because FATF was interested in having the entire global community participating in combating these global challenges, they allowed for the creation of what we call the FATF-style regional bodies, which we shorten as FSRBs. So there are 9 of them, the FSRBs across the world. Now, Uganda is one of the 9 founding members of our FSRB, the Eastern and Southern Africa anti-money laundering group, that Uganda is privileged to lead at the moment, because the tenure for leadership of the 18 member countries is 1 year on a rotational basis. So Uganda is presently the chair. So, but the standards that are applied in the FSRBs are the same, the global standards that are applied by the FATF. So once a country joins the NFSRB, then it is committing itself to apply the international standards. And these international standards are contained in what we call the FATF recommendations. So in the recommendations, you have the recommendations themselves, you have what we call the interpretative notes, and you have the glossary. So you have to read all those 3 together to have a full grasp of what the international standards in this field are. So once you have committed yourself to joining, to addressing these, then that means you have to subject yourself periodically to review, to peer review by others on how a country is doing insofar as meeting these international standards are. So that is something that I'll be coming to a little later on in my presentation. But I thought I should give you that background. But as I've said, Steve will talk more about FATF, but in his own presentation. But as I've said, you also read more about FATF, what it stands for and how it operates and other things in due course. So with that background, I'll then go straight to the background to Uganda's MLCFT framework. Now, our framework is combining several pieces of legislation, the main one being the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Then we have the Anti-Terrorism Act. Then we have the regulations under the two laws, as well as the various directives, notices, guidance notes that have been issued by the FATF. There are also other supplementary laws that guide the regulators, the law enforcement agencies, and so forth, so on and forth in Uganda. So in summary, it comprises of the laws, policies, strategies, committees, and legislation that in Uganda. In terms of the structure, we have the we have the Financial Intelligence Authority as the lead agency, but we also have the National MLCFT Task Force, which is set up by the Minister of Finance, that is responsible for treating all matters to do with in this area in the country. So Uganda's framework was first evaluated by the World Bank in February 2005 under the Financial Sector Assessment Program. and the findings were recorded in a mutual evaluation report, which was considered by ENSafrica that I've already mentioned too. The report identified deficiencies in Uganda's ML safety framework, and under the auspices of the World Bank and ENSafrica, Uganda committed to and was expected to address these deficiencies. Now, in 2005, there was no law, there was no legal framework in this area, but Uganda had already joined ENSafrica as a founding member. And when you join the ENSafrica, one of the things you commit yourself to doing, as I've already mentioned, you commit to be subjected to a peer review. So this was the one that was done in 2005. And obviously the findings were not good. I mean, if you don't have the law, then obviously you can't say you have, because the law is the one that criminalizes money laundering, that it sets up the institutions, it sets up the infrastructure and all that. So we didn't have all this in place. So as a result, the main thing that ENSafrica asked Uganda to do was to enact this law as a matter of urgency. So Uganda, but by the time this was done in 2005, Uganda had commenced the process of drafting this law with the support of the UNODC program. The UNODC has a program on anti-money laundering. So the drafting started in 2001, and the law was eventually presented to Parliament 9 years later in 2009, and it was enacted in 2013. Now, as you can see, it took a bit of time for this law to be enacted. As a result, along the way, the global community lost patience because in their view, it was taking too long for this law to be enacted. So in October 2013, the Financial Action Task Force, well, before which there in 2012, the ENSafrica issued a public statement expressing its concern about the delay to enact this law. And then subsequently, the FATF picked it up. And in October 2013, Uganda was requested to make a commitment that this law would be passed within a year. So this commitment was provided, and therefore Uganda was put on what we call a grey list in February 2014. Now the grey list is the FATF maintains a watch list. The FATF maintains a watch list of countries that are considered to have significant gaps in either the legislative and institutional framework in combating money laundering, terrorism financing. So this was Uganda was identified, and there was an action plan that was entered too. But basically, what was being asked of Uganda was to ensure that this law is enacted, including criminalizing money laundering, and also including criminalizing the financing of terrorism, because terrorism financing was already criminalized in the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2002. However, it was not fully criminalized in line with the United Nations Convention Against the Financing of Terrorism, which is a requirement of FATF. The FATF requirement is that countries should criminalize terrorism financing in line with the provisions of the UN Convention Against the Financing of Terrorism. So our TF law fell short of that definition. So we also asked to amend that. Now, grey listing means that a country has committed to addressing the identified deficiencies. So, and if a country does not meet the commitments within the agreed time frame, that's when it will then be taken to the what used to be the dark gray, and then subsequently to the blacklist. But the dark gray listing has now been abolished, so it is from gray list straight to the blacklist. So Uganda committed to doing all this, and subsequently, later that year in November 2010, the law was assented to by the president, and the Anti-Terrorism Act was also amended in 2015. And so at the end of all these processes, the FATF came to the conclusion that as far as the legal framework is concerned, Uganda's framework is now up to the required global standards. So that was the first good news, and Uganda was taken off the grey list in November of 2017. So by the time that was done, it means that we are now up to the standard, in terms of the legal framework, we measure up to the international standards. So that is, but in addition to the passage of the Anti-Money Laundering Act, it was subsequently amended in 2017, because when the original act was passed in 2013, it was, as I've said, the law was amended, was developed in 2013. I mean 2001. By the time it was passed in 2013, some of the provisions were already out of sync with international standards. So because these standards evolve quite rapidly, so these were amended into the Anti-Money Laundering Act was amended in 2017. The Anti-Terrorism Act was amended in 2015, and then we have the regulations, and then the narcotics and the enactment of the narcotics and psychotropic substances bill in 2016, because drug trafficking is one of the main predicate offenses for money laundering, and it had not been criminalized in line with that convention. So that was what was done. Now, unfortunately, in 2020, February last year, Uganda was put back on the grey list. Now, the first grey listing in 2014 was based on technical compliance. That's why the focus was on the laws. However, when the methodology for assessment was revised in 2013, there's now more focus on implementation of the laws, because the expectation of the FATF is that by now, most countries have the minimum standards in terms of the laws. So the focus has shifted to how those laws are being implemented. So the conclusion was that while the laws had been passed and were up to the required standards, they were not being implemented. For example, the investigations, prosecutions, and convictions were not in tandem with the country's risk profile. When Uganda carried out a national risk assessment in 2016-18, we came to the conclusion about which crimes generate the highest proceeds in this country. These were drug trafficking, fraud, generally speaking, including corruption. There was trade in illicit wildlife trade, deals in smuggling, and also illicit deal in minerals and the rest. But the prosecutions were not in tandem. And then also the regulatory framework in terms of application of the risk-based supervision and all these things. So the FATF came to this conclusion, and in February 2020, we were put back on the grey list. This time, and I'll outline this because this is now the current status. So we are still in the grey list. So we have done a number of things. And since February 2020, we have registered some progress. Now, what happens is that once a country has committed to addressing certain specific acts or action items, then the FATF reviews this through its processes and working groups, especially the one called the International Cooperation Review Group. Every 4 months, Uganda is required, alongside the other countries that are in this category, to submit a progress report on how those issues are being addressed. So if one compares the original statement in 2020 and compares it with the most current one, which was issued in June, because after 4 months, the FATF updates its statement. So the current statement in June 20 acknowledges the good steps that Uganda has undertaken, but also identifies the following things which need to be done. One, to seek international cooperation in line with the country's risk profile, to develop and implement a risk-based supervision of the financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions. Here we're talking about advocates, accountants, casinos, real estate dealers, and dealers in precious metals and stones. to ensure that competent authorities have timely access to accurate, basic beneficial ownership information for legal entities, to demonstrate that law enforcement agencies and judicial authorities apply the money laundering offense consistent with the identified risks, establish and implement policies and procedures for identifying, tracing, seizing, and confiscating proceeds and instrumentalities of crime, demonstrate that law enforcement agencies conduct terrorist finance investigations and pursue prosecutions commensurate with Uganda's TF risk profile, and then addressing the technical deficiencies in the legal framework to implement proliferation financing related targeted financial sanctions and implementing a risk-based approach for supervision of the NPO sector to prevent TF abuse. So it's quite quite a number of things that Uganda must do, and all these things must be done by May 2022. So we have slightly less than a year to do all those things. So you can see some of us are going quite busy, of course, working together with colleague institutions, and that's why the Uganda National ML Safety Task Force comes in handy, because it brings together all the relevant organs. And the main work that the task force is doing is to ensure that Uganda now implements all these things. So the implication of being based on the list of monitored countries or the gray listing is this: when a country is placed, it implies that every FATF member country is required to exercise caution and take appropriate steps against financial transactions originating from or destined for Uganda due to the strategic deficiencies that have been outlined, which I've indicated above. Accordingly, international financial institutions may apply enhanced due diligence measures before doing business with Ugandan entities and conduct enhanced transaction checks during any dealings. This, of course, will result in transaction delays and also increases the cost of doing business for the financial institutions, and may as much limit economic growth and development outcomes. Obviously, when investors are looking at, so it also has a negative impact on FDI, foreign domestic investments, because of the reputational risk associated with countries that are on the blacklist. Of course, one of the things, you just need to the countries that are on the blacklist, look at the countries that are on the gray list, and it's not the kind of company that you want to keep. So that's the reputational risk that comes with being on the list. Now, the other challenge is that when a country is gray listed by the FATF, the European Union, which is one of Uganda's main trading partners, and also has its own watch list. Now, for the European Union, they don't have gray listing or black, they simply have a blacklist. So once you're on the European Union, once you're on the FATF gray list, you automatically go to the European Union blacklist. So the European Union maintains its own blacklist, and one of the criteria they use for placing countries on their blacklist is if a country is on the FATF list. So as the moment Uganda was gray listed by the FATF, it was also blacklisted. I hope you see the difference in the terminologies. One is gray listing, is the blacklisting. Now, which means that since the basis of the blacklisting by European Union was the FATF gray listing, it means once we get off the FATF watch list, then automatically we'll get off the European Union watch list. One follows the other. Now, because of time constraints, I know Philip is about to tell me I'm running out of time. So now I'll simply go through I'll skip the establishment of the FIA, but all I can say is that it was established as part of the Section 18 of the Anti-Money Laundering Act, and we came into being in 1st July 2014, when myself and my colleagues were appointed to start the operations, and we're still here 7 years down the road. So quickly, I'll go through about 5 or 6 achievements, what we consider to be the main achievements. One is, again, I'll just highlight them. The details will be in my written presentation, is the improved legal framework. The situation we found in 2014 is not the situation now. We have put in place amendments to the laws, regulations, guidance notes, directives, and the rest. Of course, the second achievement is operationalization of the FIA itself. And we're now members of the Egmont Group. The Egmont Group is the group that brings together all FIUs in the world. And we're happy to join because in terms of the time we took to be admitted, we're one of the fastest. From the time we're established to the time of admission, took only 5 years, which is quite rapid. For those who know how global things move, this is quite rapid. Then we have, of course, completed the second round of our assessment. Uganda was evaluated in 2015. And then we also have the national risk assessment that was done in 2019. We now know what our risks are. And we all know the purpose of a risk assessment because resources can never be enough. So the risk assessment helps us to determine what the risks are, and then we apply our resources more where the risks are highest. It doesn't mean that we ignore the low risk, but it means there's not as much focus as on the high risk areas. We now have improved domestic cooperation because of the National ML Safety Task Force that I've mentioned. Enhanced international cooperation. I've shown statistics on how we've been cooperating with other FIUs in the region and across the world. And then also, of course, we now have a national ML safety strategy, and all the documents we have been mentioning are available on the FATF SMLAG website. They're also available on the FIA website. And then also, some money launderers have been convicted. Of course, the conviction rate is not as high as we would have wanted, but that's one of the pitfalls, which I'll mention shortly. So I will mention the pitfalls in a minute or two. Now, the main one, and the pitfalls are mentioned in the National ML Safety Risk Assessment, but the main one is that Uganda is a largely cash-based economy, which means it makes it extremely hard to track financial transactions. For economies where there are limits on what can be transacted outside the financial system, at least have an advantage. But in a cash-based economy, it is so hard to track these transactions. The second one is that we are largely informal. Many businesses are informal, so it is again difficult to track because where there are no formal structures, accountability mechanisms and structures are hard to follow up with. We also have porous borders. Now, the problem with porous borders is that one of the key cornerstones of our anti-money laundering legislation is that every person entering Uganda with the equivalent of 30 million shillings or equivalent in foreign currency, it's about 7,000 US dollars for those who are not from Uganda, is supposed to declare it at the border points. But because the criminals, if they want to declare, they have alternative border crossings, which are easy because of the porous nature of our borders. So, and no wonder this has been one of the most difficult provisions to enforce because the bad guys have alternative routes they use for evading this requirement. Of course, this one is then number 4, the low budget allocation to the agencies involved, not only the FIA, but remember we deal as a group. So if you have one entity that is well facilitated, but the next one is not. For example, the FIA is what we call an administrative FIU. We provide intelligence reports to law enforcement to investigate, that is the police and IGG. And then the IGG sends the police sent to DPP, then DPP to court. So if one member of the team is not well facilitated, for example, however well FI does its intelligence work, if you send to the police and the police officers are not trained, then that means the investigations will be poorly done. And what the DPP will look at, DPP will not look at the quality of the intelligence. The DPP will look at the quality of the investigation, of their investigation file. So that, and vice versa. If the prosecutors are not well trained, then however well an investigation is done, the whole thing crumbles. So it is a chain that must all be well oiled. Then, of course, we have the fast evolving business environment and risks associated to emerging technologies, including virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. This is the VASPs. You can talk of your cryptocurrencies and the rest. Then there's the limited uptake of FI information by the law enforcement. So we have sent so many reports to the law enforcement agencies for investigations, but the uptake is terribly low. The percentage is so low. So we're having discussions with the police and inspectorate of government as to why many of the reports we have sent are not being investigated. So that is, and one of the reasons I think we know is the limited capacity to undertake parallel financial investigations. Of course, there are some simple money laundering schemes which are easy to prosecute, but many of them tend to be very complex. So you need a bit of training there. Then we also have the challenge with non-enforcement of administrative financial sanctions. The law provides for sanctions which are administrative, but these cannot be enforced because the regulations to put this into effect are not yet in place. So, so it's there in the main act, but the regulations. So we prepared draft regulations 2 years ago and sent to the Ministry of Finance to coordinate with our first parliamentary council in the Ministry of Justice, but things are moving very slowly. So until we have the Anti-Money Laundering Act in brackets administrative sanctions regulations in place, we will not be able to enforce administrative sanctions against those entities that don't comply, the accountable persons that don't comply. Then real estate, then the next one is the real estate sector was identified as the main vehicle for hiding illicit money. So most people, once they've stolen the money, they like to invest in real estate. For the reasons which are stated in the national MLC, in the risk assessment, and one of them is the fact that this is there's a non-existent regulatory framework. So there's no one looking at how the real sector from government side. So we are in discussions with the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development to put in place that framework. Then the last but not least, the limited appreciation of the adverse effects of money laundering and terrorism financing by the public. Now, one of the areas admittedly, we have not done as much outreach to the public as we want due to various factors. So even within certain government circles, the knowledge about MLCFT is not as wide as we would have wanted. So this is one of the gaps that we significantly have. So in conclusion, I conclude by saying that Uganda's MLCFT landscape has evolved over the years with a number of important achievements registered, including significant improvement in the legal and institutional framework. The government of Uganda is committed to further strengthening the legal framework, as well as the capacity of the relevant institutions involved in the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. I wish to commend the private sector for embracing various MLCFT measures, including developing appropriate measures to mitigate identified risks. Of course, this is one of the examples because, as I've said, both ENSafrica and Standard Chartered Bank are in the private sector. So that's why when the invitation was extended to me, I grasped it with both hands. So let me conclude by reiterating the need to continue working together and maintaining a sustained effort to combat ML and TF in order to preserve the integrity of our financial system. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asubo. I don't know what is the virtual equivalent of a hand clap. If it was live and person would be calling for a round of applause for you. We thank you very much for that excellent presentation on Uganda's position in combating financial crime. Yes, for those of you who are just joining us, my name is Philip Karugaba. I'm the country head of ENSafrica Advocates in Kampala, and we are having the first of 3 events to mark the Standard Chartered Bank ENSafrica webinar on combating financial crime in Uganda. We've just heard from the Executive Director, Financial Intelligence Authority, who's been telling us some background to Uganda's struggle in combating financial crime, about our on and off presence on the grey list, and his highs and lows in his 6-year tenure in the office. We have seen lots of laws, lots of infrastructure put in place by government of Uganda. We've been pleased to hear about some successful prosecutions and more pending. He has pointed out weaknesses in the fight, our cash-based economy, porous borders, difficulty in prosecutions, and he does the investigation, but someone else must prosecute. I think that's been an old point with us, Sidney. But now, let's hear from the market. Let's hear from the market. What does the marketplace tell us about Uganda's position in combating financial crime? And to speak to us on this, we have an excellent panel of 3. We start with Stephen Powell. Stephen Powell is the head of ENSafrica's Forensics Department. He sits in South Africa. He is an admitted advocate to the South African Bar and a renowned specialist in white-collar crime prosecution and a forensics lawyer. He has more than 30 years' experience of investigating and prosecuting white-collar crime, and is highly regarded as a leading anti-corruption expert in Africa. He helps with anti-corruption compliance investigations and support in assisting clients to adhere to local and global anti-corruption laws, such as the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act. He has attended a multitude of investigations across several industries in multiple jurisdictions on our continent. Stephen also assists clients with anti-fraud and anti-bribery due diligence and compliance programs. He regularly lectures on fraud and corruption in universities of the Western Cape, Cape Town, Stellenbosch. He is recognized. Some of you may remember that Stephen has spoken in Uganda as well on a similar event. Stephen is recognized as a Band 1 leading recommended lawyer by global ratings agencies, chambers and partners, and best lawyers in regulatory compliance and corporate investigations. Okay, alongside Stephen, we also have Celia Muhwezi, who is the head conduct, financial crime and compliance with Standard Chartered Bank. Okay, she has extensive experience in legal and compliance risk management in the banking industry, having served various financial institutions previous to her joining Standard Chartered. And she has also supported Standard Chartered Bank markets, including Botswana, Mauritius, and Zimbabwe on short-term assignments. She holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in law from Makerere University and a diploma in compliance from the International Compliance Association in conjunction with the University of Manchester Business School. She's also a certified anti-money laundering specialist. Then we are also joined by Sheila Pachuto. Sheila Pachuto is a senior associate with us in Kampala, ENSafrica in Uganda. She specializes in banking and finance. And as you've heard, the real estate sector is a prime haven for illicit funds. So Sheila has acted for a variety of local and international clients on financings in leisure, hospitality, education, and logistics industries. She advises also on immigration law, and she is the officer who keeps ENSafrica advocates on the sunny side of AML laws. Welcome to you all. I will start with Stephen. Each of you has got 20 minutes to give us your take. Stephen, you're coming in as the international expert. Cecilia, you're coming in as the banker. And Sheila, you are the practitioner. Okay, over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. Good morning, everyone. And just thank you. I'm honored to be on the same panel with Sidney and Cecilia and my colleague Sheila. And thank you for that introduction, Philip. I'm just going to share my slides quickly. It's really good to be here. one of the things that I always like to do is inject a little bit of humor into a serious topic like financial crime. And I'll share with you a story that I once heard many years ago related to Zimbabwe. And it's a story about the late Robert Mugabe. And when he was doing a tour of the country in the pre-election stage, he came across a young boy in the front row of one of the school classrooms, and he said to the young boy, "Tell me, my boy, where is the capital of Zimbabwe?" And the boy's answer was quite sharp. He said, "In a Swiss bank account." So just to start on a humorous note, we'll go into some serious topics now, because Sidney, the ED, has mentioned the challenges that are faced by Uganda. And I must also just convey, listening to Sidney, I must convey my congratulations on some of the initiatives that you've managed to mobilize and get through very quickly, because I think the FIA in most countries, the equivalent body, has an enormous role to play in helping to get the country into the right gradings and categories. And it is a challenge. And I see we've chosen gray as the background to my slide, and it's quite appropriate, because I think what today is all about is, what does Uganda need to do as a country to get off this grey list? And you heard the initiatives that government is already introducing. In terms of the problem statement, the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, has identified, and you heard Sidney has emphasized this as well, that Uganda is identified as having strategic anti-money laundering deficiencies. There are challenges in terms of how Uganda addresses these deficiencies, because Sidney also highlighted the cash economy, which makes it really difficult, and the informal structures, which really make it difficult to regulate. But there is a lot that can be done. And one of the things that I noted South Africa has in common with Uganda is that when it comes to having the laws, that's one thing, but we also have to make sure that we have enforcement. And on enforcement, I also listened, because what happens is the Financial Intelligence Authority will submit suspicious transaction reports to the police, and they will highlight and flag concerns that need to be investigated. And you've heard that one of the criticisms of Uganda has been the fact that there aren't sufficient prosecutions. And I was particularly heartened to hear that there have been some successes on the prosecution front, but that needs to be bolstered. And one of the suggestions I want to make, Sidney, and this is to you and the team at the FIA, is enlist the support of bodies like the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the OECD. I know when it comes to anti-corruption, I've participated in initiatives to train and get businesses up to speed on compliance. And I know that if there is a need for training of the police, they will be able to set up programs to assist Uganda in those areas. But when we look at the Financial Action Task Force, this is an international intergovernment body which sets standards and develops and promotes policies to combat money laundering, the financing of terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. They make recommendations. And in terms of their recommendations, they've made 40 strategic recommendations that they encourage member states and organizations or countries to adopt, to make sure that they are comfortable that countries like Uganda are doing enough to prevent becoming a haven for drug dealers and money launderers. And that is the area where currently Uganda has been found wanting. And the latest statement regarding the AML strategic deficiencies is dated 25 June 2021. They state on that since February 2020, when Uganda made a high-level political commitment to work with the FATF and the ENSafrica to strengthen the effectiveness of its anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism regime, Uganda has taken some steps towards improving this regime, including adopting the strategy in September 2020 and completing the risk assessment of legal persons and arrangements. And the last follow-up to the mutual evaluation report relating to the implementation of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing standards in Uganda was undertaken in 2020. So what I've seen is a lot of movement in this area, but according to the evaluation, and this is where, as a country, Uganda is not getting a passing grade. Uganda was deemed compliant for 14 and largely compliant for 5 of the Financial Action Task Force 40 recommendations, and it was deemed highly effective for 0 and substantially effective for 0 of the effectiveness and technical compliance ratings. I'll just explain what these recommendations are about. There are a number of categories that the 40 recommendations are broken down into. And the first one is you have to make sure that you have the policies for anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, and it's got to be coordinated. There's also money laundering and confiscation, terrorist financing and proliferation, preventative measures. That's the next category. Then what is very important is we've got to have transparency and beneficial ownership of legal persons and arrangements, because a lot of organizations, money launderers hide their ownership. They conceal the ownership is hidden in trusts and schemes, and you have structures where it's impossible to work out who the actual beneficial shareholders are. That is a global challenge. Every country across the globe battles with beneficial ownership, but we have to make sure that we force organizations to declare who the real shareholders are, so that we can make sure that these are not mechanisms for corruption and for money laundering to flourish. The next category relates to the powers and responsibilities of competent authorities, and that's where we talk about supervisors and enforcement. And then the last category, and I think Sidney also highlighted this, is international cooperation. We've got to demonstrate that we're participating in the global economy. We should be assisting and collaborating with our neighboring countries and enhancing our efforts to tackle these porous borders that Sidney also referred to. Those are the categories. I'm not going to go through the 40 recommendations individually, but if we look at where we are as a country, Uganda was deemed a monitored jurisdiction by the US Department of State 2016 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report. What this means is we regarded as a country which is on a watch list because of the inability to make sure that we're not assisting drug dealers to launder money. When we look at the report, the indication was that only 20% of Ugandans have deposits in the formal banking sector. The rest of the population rely on cash transactions, alternative forms of banking. Money transfers, payments through mobile phones are proliferate in Uganda, and they're key providers of basic, if informal, financial services for low-income earners who can't afford charges in the banking system. We've mentioned, I think Sidney highlighted, the cash-based informal economy is a fertile ground for money laundering, and the lack of IP property rights legislation feeds a large black market for smuggled or counterfeit goods. So there is some legislation needed when it comes to IP, and we need to have some enforcement to prevent counterfeiting and smuggling. Most laundered money comes out of domestic proceeds, which stems from unchecked corruption. And then Sidney also highlighted real estate and casino operations are a particular concern. And then the porous borders, South Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, make Uganda more vulnerable to laundering activities and potential anti-terrorist or terrorist financing. And then the black market takes advantage of these borders and the lack of customs and tax collection enforcement capacity. The last part of the problem, and I'm highlighting the problem so that everyone understands the challenge we face in Uganda in terms of getting off the grey list, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And what I'm trying to do is I'm going to put the problem on the table, and then I want to try and stimulate debate, discussion on how we actually fix this as a country in Uganda. So there is a role for the private sector to play, and I'm going to highlight that in a moment. But the next challenge is the corruption challenge. When we look at Uganda's score on the Transparency International Corruption Index, they release an index every year, and Uganda is not faring well. We're in position 20. Our score was 27 out of 100. And Philip, I'm sorry to say, 27 out of 100 is a fail rate. We need to get to above 50. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on anti-corruption as well. And this is a challenge. You know, while you have high levels of corruption, it's very difficult to attract foreign investment. The police, the judiciary, and procurement are areas where corruption risks are perceived as very high, and under the table cash payments are expected. We've got to change the mindset. We've got to change the culture in the country that people mustn't only be willing to do something if there's something in it for them. And that is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's where I think the private sector has a role to play, and I'm going to highlight that in a moment. I'm not going to go through all the legislation. There is strong legislation in Uganda to tackle the corruption, but the challenges are exacerbated when we have weak law enforcement, because then what happens, in order to deter corrupt activity, there has to be a prospect of enforcement. People have to know that if I get involved in bribery or corruption, I'm going to be caught, so the detection levels need to improve, and I'm going to be prosecuted. There's no distinction between a bribe and a facilitation payment under Ugandan law. Sidney, if you can highlight to the authorities, that is something that the OECD, the foreign governments look at, because across the globe, facilitation payments are outlawed. What is a facilitation payment? Let me just explain to everyone. A facilitation payment is a low-value payment made to a government official to get them to do their job. We talk about it as a grease payment. And the common saying is that in Africa, the wheels turn very slowly, the bureaucracy of government. And in some jurisdictions, you need a little grease to get the wheels to turn. And that is what we call the facilitation payments. We should be outlawing that. No one should be demanding a facilitation payment before they make a copy of a document that they're obliged to make as part of their job. So we need to make sure that we improve the legislation so that we prohibit facilitation payments. I'm going to refer to one of the cases that I dealt with quite recently. It was a high-profile case in South Africa, and it was an investigation into corruption in an ICT company where they were paying bribes in order to win lucrative government contracts. And when we analyzed that, we found there was lots of collusion with the original equipment manufacturers, the big software companies, Microsoft, SAP. And these companies operate in Zimbabwe, in Uganda as well. And it's important to make sure that these risks in terms of the procurement are managed. What we found was massive collusion with government officials in tender irregularities, tender fixing. The government officials were drafting the tenders in a way to favor the particular entity. They were avoiding tender by expanding existing tenders and contracts and extending one tender that was won in 2000. 20 years later, it's still operating, but it's morphed into a whole lot of other services that have been rendered. Each of those other services should have gone to tender, or we have the single source procurement exception, where you avoid a tender by highlighting that this entity is the only one that can provide the service. And then one of the things that we find in corruption across the globe, third parties, the use of middlemen, politically connected influencers. And these individuals influence tenders, they facilitate payments to government officials, and often their fees are exorbitant. So those are the types of systemic corruption that we found in the private sector in South Africa. And this particular case brought a whole lot of the different examples together. It was quite a serious case. I had to go and testify at the Zondo Commission, the State Capture Commission in South Africa, because what happened is there was also political donations. The ruling party was taking political donations at the same time that they were dishing out tenders, and it was almost like a quid pro quo. If you made a particularly hefty political donation, your company would get awarded a particular tender. And there was a serious lack of governance, oversight, and controls. Now, the reason I highlighted that particular case study is because it's imperative for organizations, and this is where I think the private sector has a major role to play, for organizations to get their own house in order, to make sure they have their own anti-corruption policies, processes, and the same applies to anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing. So when we look at what is required, what are the things that Uganda should be considering as a country? Legislation, definitely enhancements are required. The criminalization of facilitation payments, I think that's an easy fix that needs to be remedied. In terms of the UK, what they've done is they've introduced the UK Bribery Act, and they've introduced in the UK Bribery Act, they've got a Section 7, which criminalizes the failure to prevent corruption. Now, why am I highlighting this? Because by criminalizing the failure to prevent corruption, if a company has a bribery scandal, even without a conviction, the regulator can go to that company and they can say, show us your policies to prevent anti-money laundering, anti-corruption. And if you don't have the policies, then you haven't prevented the corruption, and then they charge you with an offense of failing to prevent. Now, this is something that Uganda should be considering as a country. The French government have done the same with the French Penal Code. They call it Sapin II. It was named after the former French finance minister, and it proactively forces companies to put measures in place. So those measures, I'm not going to go into any detail. We've got 2 more legs of this program, and in the next session, we'll go into a bit more drill down on what these mean. But the first is that you've got to have the policies, the proportionate procedures to prevent corruption. There's got to be tone at the top. Leadership must set the example on ethical conduct. You need to do a risk assessment of your own organization. And this is the medicine for the private sector to get their anti-corruption processes up to speed. And then very importantly, you've got to make sure you're not using these corrupt middlemen. So you've got to do due diligence on business partners. And on the AML side, KYC, know your customer, and enhanced KYC that is risk-based becomes critically important. Training and awareness, and then you've got to have processes to monitor the corruption risk. The private sector has to play a role, and there has to also be robust enforcement. And Singapore is probably the best example when it comes to enforcement, because Singapore had a terrible reputation and they clamped down on corruption with a zero tolerance process. And if you look at Singapore today, it's one of the cleanest countries on the globe. One of the mechanisms that we in South Africa have adopted, I was on a presidential task force investigating the use of lifestyle audits to tackle these government officials who suddenly become wealthy millionaires, big property investors, but they're earning a government salary. And there's no way, when you look at the income versus the empire, that it's commensurate. And so in South Africa, we've been pushing government to introduce lifestyle audits for cabinet ministers, because we've got a number of cabinet ministers. At the Zondo Commission, we had our Minister of Water and Sanitation explaining to the Zondo Commission how she got an Aston Martin sports car as a favor from a friend, a family friend. Those are things that can easily be checked, and it's quite a useful mechanism, and it's something that Uganda should consider introducing. And then the other is just looking at the bodies to investigate financial crime. The SFO, the Serious Fraud Office, are the body in the UK that enforces the Bribery Act. And what is also happening is government is using, in the UK and the US, anti-corruption enforcement as a mechanism to extract fines and revenue from companies that get involved in illicit activity. So those are things to consider. We in South Africa have adopted the OECD recommendations, and we don't have the time to go through this. I will share my slides with all the delegates, and you'll see these are the OECD recommendations. And I think it's important for Uganda to also make sure that it is addressing that. I'm not going to go into the US legislation, but they've got a robust policy of pursuing foreign bribery, and they call that legislation the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And just to give you a feel for the type of revenue that the US government has extracted for the US fiscus out of fining companies that bribe, you can see the numbers. They earn $2.5 billion a year out of fining companies that get involved in corruption. This is the top 20 as of last year, and you'll see the numbers that they impose in fines are astronomical. So that's another area for the Ugandan government to consider, penalizing companies that get involved in corruption. The world is getting tougher on corruption. Uganda needs to do the same. We need to show that this is not a fertile environment to pay bribes in order to win contracts. So that was just to sow some seeds for discussion, for debate, and I'm going to end now because my 20 minutes are up. Thank you, Philip.
Wow, thank you very much, Stephen. I will call for a virtual round of applause for you. Absolutely stunning. I think it is, how do you call it? I felt a shiver go down my spine when you said all these things. Very, very exciting stuff. And I think that the experience which you brought to this event, the experience which Sidney has brought to this event, and coming from countries like Uganda and South Africa, who have got special credentials in this area of corruption and AML and so on, I think this is a very, very rich event, and I thank you all for your contributions. You know, I think Uganda, this is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call. In terms of assessment, in terms of ranking and scoring, this isn't the Olympics. There's no gold for us in this one. 27 out of 100. 27 out of 100 is really, really dismal. And we heard from Sidney the risks. We could get locked out of the international financial economy. The story is always the same. We have good laws, we have strong institutions, no shortage there, but weak enforcement, okay? Weak enforcement. In the next event, we will be speaking to a judge from the Anti-Corruption Court, and we'll also be speaking to an officer from the Directorate of Public Prosecutions. This distinction between bribe and facilitation payment is amazing. We always hear members of parliament asking for facilitation to do their work. So it's illegal, or it should be legal. That's interesting. As a cue for the entry of our next speakers, we have, Stephen has pointed us heavily in the direction of the role of the private sector, okay? What should the private sector be doing to combat this issue? Policies, risk assessment, KYC, you know, I think it's very, very exciting. And then there's even one for our tax body, looking at the fines that can be levied on corruption activities, looking at the US government raking in $2.5 billion per annum. How much are we going to get from our oil? I mean, this seems to be low-hanging fruit. Does the expression apply here? You know, talk about widening the tax base. We should be looking at this as widening the sources of revenue for government. Okay, if people are going to be corrupt, then we're going to go after them and see if we can pick some of this money. Stephen, thank you very, very much. I will now invite Celia from Standard Chartered Bank, Head of Conduct, and she will give us her perspective from the banking side. Thank you, Celia. You have 20 minutes, starting from now.
Thank you, Philip. And thanks to everyone who has shared their experience coming from Sydney's perception and what they've been able to do from an FIA perspective Stephen, of course, reminding us how well we are doing from a global perspective. It's not a good story. I still think, yes, it's a grim story, but there are many things, as we have shared, that we can possibly do as the people of Uganda, as businesses and professionals, to ensure that this situation improves. As Sidney has shared, the public side is doing a lot of work in ensuring that we are walking this journey to improve our standing from a global perspective in how we are managing financial crime, how we are implementing policies, policy positions and legislation around money laundering and terrorist financing. But the reality is that it has to be a concerted effort. It has to be a coordinated approach with us in the private sector. So I will share briefly my perspective and on what we as a private sector can do. And this will be drawn from what we are doing as Standard Chartered Bank, as participants in the financial services industry. Of course, financial services providers have led the journey in ensuring compliance, drawing from the fact that we play on a global scale. So we were forced into ensuring that we meet these standards. But the reality is that, as we have spoken, as our senior have shared, not just financial services providers, accountable persons. There are many other persons that are listed in the Anti-Money Laundering Act. We have real estate agents, we have lawyers, we have casinos, we have telecommunications companies, and also others. And which means that if we start to understand and appreciate our role in driving our compliance, then we are supporting the public side in ensuring that we achieve effectiveness and compliance as expected. The reason why we are on the because the of compliance lacking. Yes, we have the laws, we have law enforcement, we have judiciary, supervision bodies, but the reality is the law implementing standards.
Celia, we seem to have, we seem to have a sound problem on your side.
Yes.
Yeah, we seem to have a sound problem. Okay, just test it again. Just test again. You were coming through garbled. If you could give me a sentence now.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
You can't hear us? Okay, your connection seems to be a bit weak. Maybe try closing other applications on the laptop, or maybe shutting down the cameras as well. Yes, thank you, the participant. Someone is recommending you can shut your video. Someone has added it's nothing personal. Okay. No. Celia, should we ask, maybe you speak to your IT and then we take Sheila and we come back to you? Okay, while you handle with your IT. There's a lot of interest in your presentation.
Am I better?
Try again. Give us a sentence. Give us a sentence, Celia. Okay.
Yeah.
Celia. Okay, Celia, let's move to Sheila Pachuto, and we will come back to you shortly. Sheila is the Sheila is with ENSafrica, and she advises us on and keeps us safe on these AML issues. Just a reminder to everybody that please post your questions in the Q&A box. And I see Isaac Semakade is very busy already. He's saying Sydney's FIA is grasping at straws. Sidney will ask you to comment on that. Then one attendee is saying, Sidney, thank you very much for the simplified and comprehensive discussion. Please share the draft administrative sanctions for public review and comment. And then another attendee says they would like to know whether Uganda's being put on the grey list twice rapidly shows significant progress, and will we make the 2022 deadline? Okay, Sheila, you have 20 minutes. We'll come back to Celia. Yes. Okay. Sheila, you're up next.
Okay, thank you, Philip, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for making the time to attend today's session. Mine will be to discuss our topic today, which is combating financial crime in Uganda, and I'll be looking at it from where I sit, which is from an advisor's perspective. I think that Sidney and Stephen have already alluded to this, that we have seen that it's been a journey, a legal journey in coming up with laws that combat financial crime. There was a time when, the only legislation that we had to deal with financial crimes was a penal code, to now having full-fledged laws such as the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the Anti-Terrorism Act, all these which are being geared towards our fight to prevent financial crime. So I think that as a country, we have done something. We are not where we should be, but I think that we are doing, we are not where we used to be, and it's a work in progress. Another thing that we see in this is that the law that is in place is kind of rallying the troops to be able to put in place measures and measures to detect and prevent financial crime. You will find that when you look at the Anti-Money Laundering Act, it creates a special group of people who it refers to as accountable persons. These are persons who by the nature of their business, they are predisposed to being used as a conduit for these financial crimes. So the law is creating this special group of persons, and it is also imposing on them, duties and obligations to be able to detect and prevent this crime. There are a number of duties and obligations, but I think the most obvious is, first of all, that all these accountable persons must register with the Financial Intelligence Authority. Such registration, thankfully, it's such a straightforward and free process, and within, let's say, a week, you can get your certificate of registration. So all accountable persons are called upon to register, and this puts you under the supervision of the Financial Intelligence Authority. The other thing that we are seeing is that the other duty or obligation that is being imposed on accountable persons is that they must put in place due diligence measures, or they must put in place policies that properly identify the third parties that they are dealing with. It's no longer business as usual, a situation where you market your product to a third party and you onboard them and immediately start providing a service. What the law is requiring is that as soon as you get into that relationship with that customer, you need to know who they are. You need to find out, you need to request for, let's say, identity documents, ask for their IDs, ask for their passports, ask for their constitutional documents so that you know who you're dealing with. The law is also requiring that you do a little bit of a background check. I know that, there are some gaps here and there, because if a person shares a copy of their national ID, how do you verify? So there is a need for a link between, the stakeholders in the financial market and, let's say, the NERA, so that it's easy to verify. Once you do a background check, you can get a confirmation on the validity of that document being provided. I know that Sidney said that it's a work in progress, but I think it will really strengthen all our efforts towards combating financial crime. Another thing that we are seeing is that the law is imposing on us, and I say us because even law firms are accountable persons, is imposing on us an obligation to maintain records. So you've received all this information from your customer. They provided their IDs, they provided all their information. The law is requiring that please keep that information in a written or electronic form, so that should you ever be called upon by the FIA, at least you have that information and you can provide that information to assist in the investigation that Sidney was talking about. The law is also requiring us to report suspicious transactions. If you are dealing with a customer or a client and the nature of the transaction is suspect, I know that the definition of suspicious will be wide, but I think that the market will kind of dictate what is unusual or is suspect, requiring you to report such transaction to the FIA. So it's an obligation, and if you don't, there are penalties that can arise out of that. We are also seeing that engaging in financial crime has, it has such dire consequences. It's not one of those things that you will do and kind of get away with it. The law, I know, is not as strong as it should be, but there are implications that come with breaking the law against money laundering. For instance, the law imposes administrative and criminal sanctions against persons who engage in anti-money laundering. We have seen cases where hefty fines have been imposed on individuals who have engaged in money laundering. We've seen seizure of property and the like, and that all goes to show that it's not something that we should take for granted. We should all do our part, especially as accountable persons, to put in place systems such that we are not taken advantage of by these criminals in committing this crime. I think, like Sidney alluded to, from the courts, we are seeing that, yes, there are convictions that are being done by the courts for persons who engage in financial crimes. The law provides that if an individual is engaged in money laundering, they are subject to imprisonment of a term not exceeding 8 years. So it's a real serious issue. And I think that all of us who are engaged in this market need to do our part. Us as accountable persons need to put in place a system that are required to be able to prevent this crime, and the regulator needs to do its part as well in enforcing the law or the systems that are in place so that we have a robust financial system. Thank you. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Sheila. That was excellent. Just a reminder to all, the Q&A box is open for your questions, which will be shared with the panelists and our keynote speaker to be addressed when we complete. We now go to Celia. Are you back online, Celia? Give me a sentence, Celia.
Yes.
Excellent.
Morning. I'm so sorry, everyone.
Excellent.
Yeah.
You may proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Going back to the bank story, the network has nothing to do with the bank story. This is not how banks work. But just to pick up where I started, private sector, of which financial services providers have led the journey into managing financial crimes as they exhibit under money laundering and terrorist financing, have generally led the way because of playing on the global landscape, participating in transfers, that are cross-border in many cases. But as I shared earlier and has been highlighted by Sidney and by Sheila, the Anti-Money Laundering Act does not restrict the responsibility for compliance or for detecting and preventing money laundering and terrorist financing to financial services providers. There are many other professions and business entities that are highlighted as accountable persons. We have casinos, we have lawyers, we have real estate agents who have been cited earlier as, you know, an area of weakness, even as we sit on the grey list currently. But then there are also non-profit organizations who all collectively have a responsibility to ensure that we are complying with the standards, international standards for managing money laundering and terrorist financing, and which are encapsulated for us under the Money Laundering Act. So what is it that us as financial services providers should be doing to ensure that we meet compliance? I know that it's a challenging responsibility that we undertake as we meet compliance. But in the bank, we like to tell our staff as we share this responsibility that we need to know the whole story. Managing financial crime is not just about, you know, ensuring that people who have participated in illegal activity keep the wealth. It's also the impact that it has on us, on the business environment in Uganda, but then also the people of Uganda. I like to always use the example of the many young people that we hear sending videos to Uganda about the experiences that they are having outside Uganda, you know, in Middle East countries. These people are told that they are going to, you know, to the best time. They are going to experience the best time. They are going to get job security. They are going to earn an income. But there are many pieces of that story that a person who intends to gain from them has not told them. These people sell everything that they have and, you know, go to this dream world. But the videos that we see circulating around tell a totally different story. So what us as accountable person should aim to do is ensure that that person who has lied to that Ugandan, leading them to sell everything that they have to go to this dream, this person should not be allowed, you know, to use our products and services to enjoy this wealth. So all of us, whether you're a Ugandan or you fall into the category of an accountable person, should be ensuring that you're participating in this management of financial crime, ensuring that we make this abuse not lucrative for everyone. So that is something that we tell our staff in the bank to try and sell this story. We ensure that they understand the whole story. We ensure they understand the impact that it has on us as Ugandans, the impact that it has on our reputation. We ensure that they understand that collectively we all have to be doing what we need to do, and which is shown in the Anti-Money Laundering Act, to ensure that we are limiting those vices. We are ensuring that they do not continue. So we've spoken to the accountable persons. There are many accountable persons. I would encourage each of us who fall in that category to understand what our responsibilities are. Stephen, in his presentation, has on a high level spoken to the controls framework, the compliance framework that we should be putting in place, knowing who our customer is, ensuring that we have policies and procedures. We have risk assessed our business to understand the risks. What are those areas in our business, in our products, in our services that can be abused by someone intending to participate in money laundering or terrorism financing? Okay, so we must have, you know, a good policy framework, a good compliance framework to ensure that those risks, as they are identified, they are mitigated. So we should have also a senior enough officer within our outfits, within our businesses, who is helping us to, you know, to keep the required awareness, to keep the required standards, someone who can interact with the board and ensure that they understand what it is the organization is trying to do. We should ensure that we are keeping good records for transactions, for services, for products, for our business. As Sidney and Stephen have alluded, there should be good records to facilitate investigations. There should be good records for evidence in terms of what is it that you're doing as a business, as an organization, as an individual, to show that you're meeting compliance. There should be a responsibility for reporting. Reporting is a significant part of this controls framework for compliance with the AML Act. The FIA, the judiciary, the law enforcement sit outside our operations. The only way they become aware of the information that we have in terms of what we see as we interact with our customers, with service providers, in terms of, depending on what product or service that you offer, is if we are able to report and to report in a timely manner. So you should be able to meet your responsibilities under the Act for reporting. So as I've shared earlier, that is really high level from a controls framework, but the purpose of this presentation is not really to lay out the whole standard, but to make you aware of this responsibility and to remind you that the Act is there to provide guidance. The Financial Intelligence Authority is there to support you, but entities that have also gone ahead of you, like financial services providers, like us in banks, are available to support. And that's, part of the reason why we have platforms like this to share best practice, to call attention to this responsibility, to call attention to the fact that it is achievable, it is doable. So the benefits have been touched in terms of improving our reputation as a country, improving the economic environment in which we operate, ensuring that people outside Uganda are willing to invest, are willing to participate in developing Uganda, but then also as professionals who are playing in the Uganda landscape, looking to play on the global landscape, it improves the environment in which we operate. And lastly, it protects Ugandans, as I spoke earlier, to the people who are being duped, where someone is just looking to gain a buck from them and misleading them and sending them into human trafficking, selling them drugs, and for their own benefit. That kind of person, as I said earlier, should not be allowed to enjoy that wealth. And this whole framework, as we have spoken to it, ensures that that happens, which means that we have that responsibility to meet those standards so that we can control this environment and enjoy the benefits. As I close, I would like to draw attention to the penalties, especially for accountable persons or people who are charged with offenses under the Money Laundering Act. I believe that there are few businesses in our market which will continue to operate seamlessly if they are actually fined under the Anti-Money Laundering Act. So I would like us to create the necessary awareness, make sure we understand the possible penalties that we might be faced if we are penalized under the Anti-Money Laundering Act as it currently sits. If the other things do not persuade us to meet compliance, the penalties should definitely persuade us if we want to be a sustainable business, if we want to be a business that is in this market and operates tomorrow. We should ensure that we are not penalized, and that the only way we ensure that is by ensuring that we take reasonable measures so that our products and services are not used by anyone to participate or to further a money laundering or terrorist financing activity, which is prohibited under the law. I'll hand back. I know that we are towards the end, but I hope that as accountable persons, as the people in Uganda, we use the information that we have gained today, not to be discouraged because of the negatives that we see the possible reputational risks that we suffer as the people of Uganda, as the businesses in Uganda, but to know that there are things that we can actually do to ensure that this situation improves, and that there are people who are well versed with this knowledge, who are willing to support you as we work together as the private and the public sector to improve our standing, get off the grey list, and enjoy the benefits of playing on the international platform. That's all from me, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecilia. We are glad for the persistence and coming back and giving us such an excellent and insightful presentation. I'm afraid this is all we have time for. As they say in Uganda, a good place is never your home. Otherwise, the dog would never leave the butcher house. But for those who have posted these excellent and exciting questions in the Q&A box, we will log the questions and ensure that you get responses. I think someone is asking what a suspicious transaction is. That question is for Sheila. And then another question is that we've been slow in getting off the grey list. What are we going to do and avoid the ping pong of being added or dropped? Then another question is, what can we do with the existing legal infrastructure to help combat financial crimes? Okay. Then there's a complaint about, why don't we allow private prosecution? Largely, the courts seem to be resisting it and saying, let's walk the talk. We will, I promise, catalog this and make sure that you get answers. Another question is, has Sudan been put off the sanctions list? Okay, so as I said, this is what we have time for. Our next event will be looking at these questions in granular detail. We'll also have a prosecutor available to tell us more from what they see in the courts. For now, I just say thank you very much to our keynote speaker, Mr. Sidney Asubo. Thank you to our panelists, Celia from Standard Chartered Bank, Sheila Pachuta from ENSafrica. And we thank you all the attendees, and Stephen Powell from ENS South Africa. And as we have seen, there are big issues to deal with here. Each one of us has a role to play, whether you're in the government or in the private sector. This is not one of those situations where we say, to saba government, etuyambe, okay? That we are waiting for government to help us. If you're in government, you can do. If you're in private sector, you also have a role to play and you can do it now. I thank you all and wish you a nice rest of the day. Thank you.